I'm convinced that melody's always been the primary structural element of music. We know that melody evolved first. From about the 10th century to the 17th century, melody supplied the structure of music through the cantus firmus. Even in the classical period, we find Beethoven sketching his Opus 49 No. 2 sonata as a single line melody. So it seems a little curious that all we ever talk about in music theory class is harmony. In most music theory classes, we assume that harmony is the basis of music. As much as I would like to argue with this point of view, I must admit it is sometimes true. Take, for example, the opening of the second suite from Daphnis and Cloyd by Maurice Ravel. I can't imagine that the opening figure in the flutes popped into Ravel's mind as a kind of theme. Imagine that as a cantus firmus and counterpoint class. There is eventually a kind of simple melody in the strings, but it's just a single measure repeated over and over. No, melody cannot have come first in this music. This music must be structured by harmony. A reduction of this busy score shows that it's based on a series of harmonies. The longest chord, an E minor 7, begins in major 8 and resolves to a B minor 7 in major 15. The key signature has two sharps, so I assume that Ravel's planning for the piece to be in B minor. That makes the E minor chord leading to the B minor chord a plagal cadence. This chord progression gives structure to the end of the passage. A D sharp dominant chord leads into the E minor chord. The D sharp provides a kind of leading tone that leads into the E. The preceding chords simply rock back and forth, the bass notes moving by thirds. If chords structure the passage, where does the melodic material come from? I believe that the pitches used in Ravel's figurations can be derived from these chords. Ravel uses 5-note patterns. These patterns are expressed as scales above each chord in this analysis. All of these scales are pentatonic scales. Notice that the scales in the first system do not follow the standard pentatonic pattern. They consist primarily of the pitches of the chords below them, with one pitch added to complete the 5-note pattern. The scales in the second system are also made up of pitches from the chords, however, they are conventional pentatonic scales. This leads me to believe that Ravel planned for the figuration and the melody to be pentatonic, but that he was forced to adjust the pentatonic scales to fit the chord progression at the beginning. Notice also that the scales change with each chord. In conventional music theory, we tend to treat a scale as the pitch material for an entire key. We don't change scales unless we change keys. Here Ravel is treating the scales as if they were the pitch material for only a single chord, as if he were changing keys and scales every time he changed chords. Some post-19th century composers treat their pitch material in this fashion. I know I often do. The notion that harmony can structure music predates Ravel by 200 years. Rameau's treatise on harmony from 1722 describes the idea of a fundamental bass line. A fundamental bass line is based on the idea that chords have roots. This is different from the concept that chords have inversions. Anybody who's studied three-voice counterpoint knows that you can harmonize a bass note with an octave and a third or with a fifth and a third, and that these two chords are essentially the same. They knew this in the 18th century, but they really didn't care. They also knew that you could harmonize the same note with an octave and a sixth, and that this was a different chord. But again, they didn't care. They didn't care what the root of the chord was, only that it was a consonance that fit the counterpoint. Rameau did care. He cared because he realized that if you extracted the roots of the chords and examined them, patterns would emerge. These patterns would show that harmony could give music structure, a different kind of structure than melody. This idea changed the way that people thought about music. Rameau's method of extracting a fundamental bass line, showing the roots of chords on a separate staff, revolutionized music theory. It allowed theorists to track harmonic patterns and thereby show similarities and differences between different pieces. The primary pattern that Rameau noticed was that the roots of chords descend by perfect fifths, or that they ascend by perfect fourths. It's inversion. Rameau established this as a kind of norm. He wrote, "The fifth should be considered the best interval suited to the bass. In fact, we never hear a final cadence or the end of a piece in which this progression is not the primary element." The problem with Rameau's method is that similarities and differences between harmonic progressions are sometimes hard to spot, because pieces in different keys have different bass lines, even if their harmonic progressions are the same. Georg Vogler found a solution to this problem in the late 18th century by introducing the method of Roman numeral analysis. Vogler used Roman numerals to indicate the scale degrees of the notes in the fundamental bass line. This meant that patterns in different keys could be easily compared, as in this example where Vogler is illustrating the idea that root movement should progress by fifths. Numerous theories of harmony emerged in the 19th century. These usually confined to fundamental bass, often using Roman numerals, with a theory of progression, usually that the roots of chords progress by perfect fifths. This led, at the end of the 19th century, to the kind of music theory we teach in American music schools today. This is usually called functional harmony. I like to call it American functional harmony, because there's another kind of music theory that's taught in Germany, and it's also called functional harmony. American functional harmony actually has German, or maybe Austrian, roots. It comes mostly from the writings of Percy Getchus, who studied and taught in Germany before moving back to America, where he taught at numerous institutions, including the New England Conservatory of Music. Getchus explained his version of functional harmony in his book, The Theory and Practice of Tone Relations. What we mean by chord function in American functional harmony is this. You can build a chord on all 7 steps of the diatonic scale. Actually, Getchus himself excluded the leading tone chord. I'll explain this later. Each one of these chords has a function which is to move to another specific chord. This specific chord generally has a root a perfect fifth below the root of the chord leading to it. Getchus claimed that chords could be built on all scale degrees except the leading tone, and that the importance of each one of these chords, quote, depends upon the distance of its root from the tonic and perfect fifths, what he called the natural scale. Here's Getchus's natural scale. It's built on C, but places the subdominant below tonic on F, so that all of the pitches of the scale can be a perfect fifth apart. All of these chords progress to tonic through a series of descending fifths, except the subdominant, which moves up a perfect fifth to C through a plagal progression. While Getchus recognized 6 chords, he saw 3 of them as principal chords and 3 of them as subordinate. The 3 principal chords are 1, 5, and 4, tonic, dominant, and subdominant. He said that, quote, the functions of the subordinate triads, though not identical, are so very similar as to justify this classification. The subordinate chords act mainly as substitutes for their respective principal chords, and deduce almost all of their harmonic relations from the latter. Here's an example from Getchus's book. The 6 substitutes for tonic, the 2 for subdominant, and the 3 for dominant. Notice that this chart shows that the subordinate chords share 2 pitches with their principal chords. They are so similar to the principal chords that they differ only by 1 pitch. Notice also that Getchus labels these chords as parallels to the chords for which they substitute. This is a confusing label, because usually we would regard the minor 6 as the relative of a major 1. Getches shares this usage of the term parallel with Hugo Riemann's German functional harmony. Getch's theory has a few holes in it. The first one appears when Getches describes the two-chord. Quote, "This is in reality the fundamental representation of the subdominant." I think what he means by this is that in practice the two-chord is the principal chord because it moves into the dominant chord by a descending perfect fifth. The true subdominant, the four-chord, doesn't do this. It moves to the dominant by a second. And then there's the leading tone chord. According to Getches, it doesn't exist, or rather it doesn't exist as an independent chord. He lists several reasons for this. Number 1, because it contains the leading tone as its apparent harmonic basis. Number 2, because its most natural progression is into 1 and 6. Number 3, because the comparison of this chord with the 5-7 discloses a similarity of effect. Since it can't exist as a separate chord, it must exist as a part of another chord, the 5-7. Here's an example showing the leading tone chord as a 5-7 without a root. He calls these incomplete 5-7 chords. He has even devised a figured bass number to denote this, a 0. The German approach to chord function comes from Hugo Riemann and his book Harmony Simplified. I used to wonder if the title was a joke. Here's a page from the book to give you an idea of its general level of complexity. It looks more like a text for higher math than for music theory. I think the idea of the book being a simplification is that it is simpler than certain older German harmonic theories, like the theories of Moritz Hauptmann. In any case, Riemann's theory is fairly simple in its most basic concept. There are three functions, the tonic, T, the dominant, D, and the subdominant, S. Notice that while Riemann's theory is similar to American functional harmony in its basic concept, it is different in its details and nomenclature. This leads to a number of complications. Just as in the Getches theory, there are three fundamental categories of chord function. However, Riemann lists two alternate chords in each category, one a third above, one a third below. For example, if C major is tonic, Riemann would call A minor its parallel. This is, of course, confusing to most of us because we would call A minor its relative. The other alternate chord for C major would be found a third above. Riemann would call it the counterparallel, TG for Gegenparallel in German. As with Getch's theory, Riemann's functional harmony tends to bog down when exceptions to the theory occur. These exceptions are explained with an increasingly complex and sometimes far-fetched list of justifications. Both types of functional harmony bog down when modality or atonality occurs. This can be a real problem because late 19th and early 20th century music often mixes these styles. There is a tendency among music theorists to try to force an explanation of the modality or atonality using traditional chord function when this occurs. In practice, most American music theory teachers ignore the more rigorous aspects of functional harmony. Modern textbooks often include a nifty chord progression chart that's based on these theories of chord function. These charts can be consulted without any explanation of how they were derived. This chart is based on root movement by descending perfect fifths. Exceptions are listed as substitutions in the row above the chords for major and below the chords for minor. These exceptions, like the subdominant chord, are usually explained in a matter-of-fact way. Here's what the Cascapane tonal harmony textbook says about the subdominant. Most often, the 4 has a predominant function, moving directly to 5 or 7, or it may prolong the predominant area by moving first to 2 or to 6. In a very different role, 4 may proceed to a 1 chord, sometimes called a plagal progression. So the subdominant can do 5 different things. Notice that none of the explanations from the Cascapane includes root movement by descending perfect fifth. I would like to say that the Cascapane textbook is just plain wrong, but it's not. What I should say instead is that American functional harmony probably doesn't work very well as a universal theoretical system. It can work well for certain pieces, but because it doesn't work well for all pieces, in order to be rigorously applied, it must include exceptions. And if there are too many exceptions to a system, it breaks down. I think it can work as a system of composition. If you follow the rules of American functional harmony, you'll end up with coherent, consistent chord progressions. These chord progressions are too bland for my taste, and I wonder if any real composers actually did this. But American functional harmony can work as a system of composition. I think one of the biggest problems that we have in music theory is that we conflate methods of composition, often mere collections of tips and techniques, with theoretical concepts to create grand musical theories. In the case of functional harmony, we have the added irony that it didn't really coalesce until around the turn of the 20th century, when the music it was trying to explain was dying out. So what method of composition did the composers of the common practice actually use? We'll talk about that next time.